The golden chandelier sparkled above Michael Adeyemi's head, casting a warm glow across the expanse of his mansion. The marble floors gleamed under the soft lights, yet none of it brought him peace. Sitting in his vast Lagos penthouse, Michael sighed, rubbing his temples. He had everything a man could dream of: wealth, power, and influence. By the time he turned 28, he had built a global empire, making him one of the richest men in Africa. Yet, his heart ached with loneliness. Women adored him, but he knew they only saw his money. Every relationship he had was the same: genuine affection always overshadowed by his wealth. Staring out over the twinkling Lagos skyline, an idea struck him. What if I'm looking for love in the wrong places? His grandmother had once told him that true love is found in the most unexpected ways. He had spent years searching for it in high society, yet every woman he met was drawn to his status, not his soul. A bold yet thrilling thought entered his mind. The next morning, he called his loyal driver, Adebayo, a man who had been with his family for over a decade. "Adebayo, I've made a decision," Michael said, his voice steady. "For the next few months, I want to live as an ordinary man. A beggar, to be exact." Adebayo's jaw dropped. "Oga Michael, beggar? Are you sure you're okay? Why would you do such a thing?" Michael smiled faintly. "To find someone who loves me for who I am, not for my wealth. I need you to help me prepare." Adebayo shook his head in disbelief, but he knew his boss well enough to understand that once Michael made up his mind, nothing could change it. And so, the transformation began. Over the next few days, Michael abandoned his designer suits for ragged clothes. His signature wristwatch, worth more than a house, was locked away. His sleek sports cars were left untouched in his garage. Adebayo found him a small shelter near a busy marketplace. It was nothing like the life Michael was used to. No soft beds, no security, no luxurious meals. That night, as he lay on a thin mat, staring up at the cracked ceiling, Michael wondered if he had made a mistake. Then he thought of love. If this was the only way to find it, then so be it. What Michael didn't know was that his journey would take unexpected turns, leading him to secrets, betrayal, and a love that would test everything he believed in. Michael sat in front of an old, cracked mirror in a small, dimly lit room that Adebayo had rented for him in the slums of Lagos. The reflection staring back at him was barely recognizable. Gone were the neatly trimmed beard and the perfectly styled hair. His once radiant skin, always treated with the finest skincare products, was now dusted with dirt and roughened by days without luxury. His clothes, once tailored to perfection, had been replaced by faded, oversized garments that hung loosely on his frame. Adebayo stood beside him, arms crossed, his face twisted with disapproval. "Oga Michael, I still no understand why you want to suffer yourself like this. You get money, you get everything way person need, yet you want to go live like poor man." Michael let out a deep sigh and turned to his driver. "Adebayo, I need to do this. If I keep living my life the way I have been, I will never find true happiness. Every woman I meet only sees my money. I want to find someone who loves me for who I am." Adebayo shook his head and muttered under his breath, "This rich people problem no be here." Ignoring him, Michael grabbed a small, tattered bag that contained only a few basic items: an old blanket, a water bottle, and a little money for emergencies. He was determined to live as authentically as possible, experiencing life as the less privileged did. Before leaving his mansion, he had instructed his business team that he would be traveling and would only communicate through his assistant. No one was to know where he was. His bank accounts remained untouched, and his phones were left behind. For all intents and purposes, Michael Adeyemi had vanished. Now, standing outside the tiny room in the heart of a noisy, bustling slum, he felt a strange mix of excitement and fear. The scent of roasted corn and grilled suya filled the air, mixed with the less pleasant smell of stagnant water from the nearby drainage. Children ran barefoot across the dusty streets, their laughter piercing through the chaos of honking vehicles and shouting traders. For the first time in his life, he was not Michael Adeyemi, the billionaire. He was just another man struggling to survive in the city. "All right, Oga. Sorry, Michael." Adebayo corrected himself. "Where you want to go first?" Michael thought for a moment. "I need to find a place where I can blend in and observe people. Somewhere I won't stand out too much." Adebayo scratched his head. Market side go makes sense. People no-go notice you there. Together, they made their way to the main market, one of the busiest parts of the city. Stalls lined both sides of the street, selling everything from fresh vegetables to second-hand clothes. The shouts of traders filled the air. Michael walked slowly, his eyes scanning the environment. For the first time in his life, he felt invisible. No one stopped to stare at him. No one whispered his name. To these people, he was just another face in the crowd. He approached a woman selling roasted plantains. "Good evening, Ma," he said politely. The woman barely glanced at him. "What do you want?" Michael hesitated. Normally, he would have just handed her a few thousand naira without thinking. But today, he had to play the part. "How much is one?" he asked. 200 naira, she replied. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out the money. As he collected his food, a sudden realization hit him. This was the first time in years he had purchased something with cash instead of a credit card. The experience was humbling. He sat down on a small wooden bench by the roadside, chewing slowly, watching the world around him. People moved with urgency, each person carrying their own struggles, their own dreams. Then he noticed her. A young woman, dressed in a simple brown dress, was serving food at a small roadside restaurant. She moved swiftly, balancing plates with expertise, her face calm despite the chaos around her. Her hair was tied back in a neat bun, and every now and then, she smiled at the customers she served. Something about her intrigued Michael. She wasn't just beautiful. She had an air of quiet strength about her, as if she had seen the worst of life but refused to let it break her. For the first time since starting this journey, he felt a flicker of something deep in his chest. Who was she? And why did he feel drawn to her? Little did Michael know, this woman would change his life in ways he never imagined. Michael woke up to the sound of a rooster crowing in the distance, followed by the early morning chaos of the slums. Hawkers were already out, shouting the prices of their goods. Mothers carried toddlers on their backs while sweeping the front of their homes, and the scent of akara frying in hot oil filled the air. He sat up, stretching his stiff limbs. Sleeping on a thin mat on the floor had left his back aching. He had always taken his king-sized memory foam mattress for granted, but after just one night in this new life, he realized how much comfort he had been accustomed to. Adebayo knocked on the wooden door and stepped inside. "Oga, sorry, Michael. How you sleep?" Michael sighed. "Not well, but I guess I have to get used to it." Adebayo smirked. "Nah so be. This life, no be for people way get soft body." Michael ran a hand over his rough, unshaven face. It had only been a day, but he was already questioning his decision. Still, he was determined to see it through. "What's the plan today?" Adebayo asked, leaning against the doorframe. "I need to find a place to sit, somewhere I can blend in," Michael replied. Adebayo nodded thoughtfully. "I know one spot for Junction. Now where all the beggars stay. If you want truly blend in, that's the best place." Michael hesitated. The idea of sitting with real beggars unsettled him. He had never begged for anything in his life. But this was the reality he had chosen. "Take me there," he said firmly. They arrived at the busy street corner where several beggars were already stationed. Some sat on old pieces of cardboard, while others leaned against the walls, their hands outstretched as pedestrians hurried past them. Michael hesitated before lowering himself onto the ground, leaning against the wall. The concrete was rough against his back, and the heat of the Lagos sun beat down on him mercilessly. Adebayo stood a few steps away, watching silently. He was still struggling to believe his boss had chosen this life voluntarily. Michael observed the other beggars, trying to mimic their mannerisms. Some called out desperately to passers-by, while others simply held out their hands in silence. He swallowed his pride and extended his hand slightly. Hours passed. People walked by, barely sparing him a glance. A young woman dropped a 5 naira coin in front of him without looking. Another man muttered something about beggars being lazy and needing to go find work as he hurried past. Michael felt a wave of shame wash over him. This was not what he had expected. He had imagined a few struggles, but he hadn't prepared for the deep humiliation of being invisible, of being treated as less than human. At midday, he was exhausted, thirsty, and hungry. His throat was dry, but he refused to touch the small amount of money that had been tossed at him. He still had some emergency cash, but he wanted to experience the struggle of those who truly had nothing. Adebayo returned with a bottle of water and a small bag of puff-puff. "You don't suffer reach for today?" Adebayo asked, crouching beside him. Michael took the water and drank eagerly. I didn't think it would be this hard, he admitted. Adebayo chuckled. Not because you never see the real struggle. You day Lagos, Oga. Sorry Michael. If you no get money, nobody send you. Just as Michael finished his last piece of puff puff, a familiar voice caught his attention. Uncle, are you okay? He looked up to see the woman from the restaurant, the same one he had noticed the day before. Her eyes were filled with concern as she knelt beside him, looking him over. She was holding a small plastic bowl of rice and stew, wrapped in a transparent nylon bag. You haven't eaten today, have you? She asked softly. Michael opened his mouth, then closed it. He wasn't sure how to respond. Without waiting for an answer, she handed him the bowl of food. Here, you need to eat. Michael stared at the meal, his heart pounding. This was the moment he had been searching for, genuine kindness, without any expectation of something in return. He looked up at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Aisha. He didn't know her story yet, but one thing was certain. She was different, and he had to know more about her. Michael hesitated before taking the bowl of food from Aisha. He had eaten meals prepared by world-class chefs, dined in five-star restaurants, and attended elite banquets. But this simple bowl of rice and stew felt more valuable than any meal he had ever had. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Aisha smiled, brushing a stray strand of hair from her forehead. It's nothing. I see you sitting here every day. You don't beg like the others, but you look tired, like someone who's not used to this life. Michael's grip tightened on the bowl. Had she seen through him? He forced a weak smile. I just fell on hard times. Life hasn't been easy lately. Aisha nodded, as though she understood. I know that feeling. She gestured to the restaurant behind her. I work there. The owner, Mama Titi, is kind enough to let me take leftover food home sometimes. I thought you might need it more than I do. Michael's eyes softened. You're very kind. She chuckled, shaking her head. I just do what I can. We all struggle in different ways. He watched her for a moment, fascinated by the way she carried herself. There was no bitterness in her voice, no resentment about her circumstances, only quiet strength. Adebayo, who had been watching from a distance, suddenly stepped closer and cleared his throat. Michael, we need to move soon. Aisha glanced at Adebayo and then back at Michael. That's your friend? Michael nodded. Yes, he's been helping me. Aisha's gaze lingered on Adebayo for a moment before she stood up. I need to get back to work. If you ever need something to eat, just ask. Mama Titi doesn't like giving out free food, but I'll try. Michael found himself smiling. I appreciate it, Aisha. As she walked away, he watched her intently. Adebayo chuckled beside him. Oga, you donde fall in love. Michael snapped his head towards him, frowning. Don't be ridiculous. Adebayo smirked. Na soy day start. Michael sighed and picked up the spoon, taking his first bite of the meal. The food was slightly cold, but it was delicious. More than that, it tasted of kindness. He sat there in silence, lost in thought. For the first time since starting this experiment, he felt a flicker of something real, a connection. Aisha intrigued him. She was unlike the women he had met in his world, women who only smiled when they saw his expensive watch or heard his last name. But who was she really? And what was her story? Later that night, after a long, exhausting day, Michael and Adebayo returned to the tiny room they had rented. Michael dropped onto the thin mattress, exhaling deeply. Adebayo, sitting on a stool near the door, folded his arms. Oga Michael, you see say this life no be joke. You want continue? Michael stared at the ceiling, thinking about Aisha. Yes. Adebayo shook his head. What do you want to do about that girl? Michael closed his eyes. I want to know more about her. Adebayo chuckled. You go hardo. You no be billionaire for here. You be beggar. You think say she go look you twice. Michael turned his head slightly, his lips curving into a small smile. That's what I want to find out. Adebayo sighed dramatically. Okay, not so love day start. Michael didn't respond. He just lay there, listening to the sounds of the night, the distant music from a nearby bar, the occasional honk of a car, the voices of people living a life so different from his own. Somewhere in this new world, in this unfamiliar life, he had found something, or someone, worth staying for. And he wasn't going to walk away. Michael woke up to the sound of shouting outside. The streets of Lagos never truly slept, but the mornings were always the loudest. Hawkers were already selling their goods, Buses honked furiously at impatient passengers, and the air smelled of roasted plantain, frying akara, and smoke from burning trash. He sat up slowly, his back stiff from sleeping on the hard floor. His entire body ached. It had only been a few days, but the struggle of the poor was already weighing heavily on him. His billionaire life had shielded him from this reality for so long. Adebayo, already awake, sat by the small window, chewing on a piece of bread. He glanced at Michael and smirked. Oga, he be like say the life of suffering Don Day show for your body. Michael exhaled deeply, rubbing his face. It's harder than I imagined. Adebayo laughed. Nah so be. You never even see anything. Michael glanced at the door, his mind drifting to Aisha. He hadn't seen her since yesterday, but he couldn't stop thinking about her kindness. He needed to learn more about her, to understand what kind of person she was. But first, he needed to survive another day. The harsh reality of begging. Michael and Adebayo arrived at the same street corner as the previous day. The beggars were already there, some chatting amongst themselves, others already calling out to passers-by. Michael lowered himself onto the hard concrete, mimicking their postures. It was humiliating, but he was determined. Hours passed. Unlike the day before, fewer people stopped to drop coins. Some glanced at him with pity. Others simply walked by, as if he were invisible. A young man in tattered clothes approached him, a smirk on his face. New guy ABI? You never sabi how he day work for here. Michael frowned. What do you mean? The man, whose name was Waisiu, crouched beside him. You think say if you just sit on here, money go come? No be like that oh. You go beg well. Cry if you need to. Talk say your leg day pain. Talk say your family die. Nah so day work. Michael's stomach turned. Pretend? Lie? That was not something he had considered. I'm not comfortable lying, he admitted. Waisiu burst into laughter. See this one. You know go last for this business. For street, nah survival be the game. Michael swallowed hard. He had come here to experience life as the poor lived it. But was he truly ready for the depths of their struggle? Adebayo, who had been watching quietly, leaned in. Oga, now you day see am. No be everybody way day beg day do am because dem want. Some no get choice. You fit go back to your mansion anytime. Dem no fit. Michael clenched his fists. He had come here looking for truth, and now he was facing it, raw and painful. Just then, a group of young men walked past. One of them, dressed in a flashy shirt, stopped and looked at Michael. See this one, he scoffed, nudging his friend. He be like say nah fresh beggar way, just enter market. His friend chuckled. See as him skin still fresh. Nah fake beggar be this. Before Michael could respond, the first man suddenly kicked over the small bowl where people had dropped coins. The little money he had gathered spilled onto the ground. Michael's heart pounded. He expected someone to help him pick up the coins, but instead, the passers-by simply looked on, uninterested. One of the older beggars, an elderly man with missing teeth, sighed. No worry, my Pekin. Not normal thing for here. Street no get pity. Michael gritted his teeth. The humiliation burned, but more than that, he felt anger, not for himself, but for the millions of people forced to endure this kind of suffering daily. Was this what it meant to be poor? To be invisible? Adebayo helped him gather the few coins left. Oga, Idan do for today? Michael shook his head. No. I need to see more. I need to understand more. Adebayo sighed. Okay, oh. But make I tell you, this life no be joke. Michael sat back against the wall, his mind racing. He had come here to find love. But now, he realized he was finding something else. He was finding truth. Michael had never truly understood desperation until now. It had been a full week since he began living as a beggar. Each day was a brutal reminder of how unforgiving the world could be to the poor. The humiliation, the hunger, the exhaustion. He had read about poverty in books, seen it on the news, but nothing compared to experiencing it firsthand. His once pristine skin had darkened under the Lego sun, his neatly trimmed beard had grown rough, and his body, accustomed to soft silk sheets and air-conditioned comfort, now ached from sleeping on the hard floor. And yet, he couldn't walk away. He wouldn't walk away. Not yet. Aisha's troubles. Michael sat in his usual spot, watching the world move past him. From where he sat, he could see the small restaurant where Aisha worked. She hadn't noticed him yet, but he had noticed her. She was different today. There was a heaviness to the way she moved, a tiredness in her shoulders. She wasn't smiling as she usually did. Something was wrong. A few minutes later, she stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. As she turned to leave, Michael saw an older woman, a large, intimidating figure, march out of the restaurant after her. It was Mama Titi, the owner of the restaurant. Michael leaned in, trying to hear their conversation. I don't want excuses, Aisha. Mama Titi's voice was sharp and unforgiving. You still owe me 3 months' rent. I won't allow you to stay in my house for free. Aisha's voice was small. Mama Titi, please. I just need more time. I promise I'll pay you soon. Mama Titi scoffed. You've been saying that for months. If you don't pay by the end of this week, I'm throwing you out. Michael's heart clenched. Aisha was struggling, just like the countless others he had met on the streets. But the difference was, she had helped him, even when she had nothing. And now, she was on the verge of losing her home. Mama Titi stormed back inside, leaving Aisha standing there, looking lost. She exhaled shakily, wiped her eyes quickly, and forced herself to keep moving. Michael made a decision. He wasn't going to just sit there and do nothing. A daring offer. Later that evening, as Aisha finished her shift, Michael waited for her outside. She was surprised to see him standing there. Oh, it's you, she said with a small smile. Did you eat today? Michael nodded. I did. Thanks to you. Aisha nodded, relieved. Good. He hesitated before speaking. I heard what happened earlier. With Mama Titi. Aisha's face stiffened. You were listening? I didn't mean to, Michael admitted. But I want to help. Aisha gave a short laugh. Help? You're just a beggar, Michael. How can you help me? Michael swallowed. If only she knew the truth. I may not have money, but I can work, he said instead. Let me help you. Maybe I can find a job. Maybe. Aisha shook her head. Michael, you barely have enough to eat. I appreciate the thought, but I have to handle this on my own. Michael saw the pride in her eyes. She wasn't the kind of woman who liked accepting help. She was a fighter. And yet, he couldn't let her suffer alone. So, he made a bold decision. What if we worked together, he said. We could. But before he could finish, a loud shout interrupted them. Thief! Catch that thief! Michael barely had time to react before a young boy came running past them, clutching a woman's handbag. Behind him, an angry mob chased after him. Michael turned, heart pounding. He recognized the boy. It was Waisiu, the beggar who had given him advice days ago. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He had always known the streets were rough. But this was about to change everything. Michael's heart pounded as he watched Waisiu sprint through the crowded street, dodging vendors and leaping over wooden crates. The angry mob chasing him grew louder, their shouts filling the air. Thief! Catch the thief! The boy was fast, but the crowd was determined. Michael didn't think, he reacted. Without warning, Waisiu tripped over a pothole, his small frame hitting the ground with a painful thud. The handbag slipped from his grip, landing a few feet away. Before Waisiu could scramble to his feet, the first man in the mob reached him. A muscular vendor, his face twisted with rage, kicked the boy hard in the ribs. Waisiu cried out in pain. Michael's blood ran cold. The mob closed in, surrounding Waisiu like a pack of wolves. Useless thief, one man spat. Not today you go learn, another shouted. A large woman picked up a broken wooden plank. Let's teach him lesson. Michael couldn't stand back and watch. Without thinking, he lunged forward, pushing his way through the angry crowd. Stop! Stop, he shouted. He's just a boy. Nobody listened. The first slap landed across Waisiu's face. Then a kick. Another blow. The boy curled into himself, whimpering. Michael threw himself over Waisiu, shielding him. Leave him alone, he yelled. A few people hesitated. Others pushed forward. Why you day defend thief? Someone sneered. He goes steal from you next, another added. Michael looked up, his face desperate. Look at him. He's just a child. You want to kill him for stealing a bag? The woman who had her bag stolen finally spoke. I just want my bag back. I know kill him. The mob grumbled, their anger slowly dying down. One by one, they began stepping back. The wooden plank fell to the ground. Waisiu lay trembling beneath Michael, his face bruised and swollen. A deep silence followed. Then, a single voice cut through the tension. You should have let them beat me, Waisiu whispered, his voice thick with pain. Michael turned to him in shock. Why would you say that? Waisiu let out a bitter laugh, struggling to sit up. Because at least if they beat me, it would be over quickly. The suffering would stop. Michael's chest tightened. This was the real Lagos. This was the city where the rich flourished while the poor were left to rot. Aisha, who had been watching from the sidelines, finally stepped forward. She bent down and gently helped Waisiu sit up. "Come," she said softly. "Let's take care of your wounds." Waisiu hesitated, his eyes darting between Michael and Aisha. Why do you care?" Michael answered before Aisha could. "Because someone has to." Waisiu's lips trembled, but he said nothing. Michael looked up, scanning the faces of the remaining crowd. Most of them had lost interest and walked away. A few lingered, whispering among themselves, but the danger had passed. Still, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had changed. This experiment of his had started as a test, a way to find true love. But now, it had turned into something much bigger. The streets were teaching him things money never could. And for the first time in his life, Michael Adeyemi felt a new kind of purpose burning inside him. But he had no idea that his past, his real identity, was about to catch up with him. The sun had begun to set, casting a golden hue over the city. The once chaotic streets were now calmer, as vendors packed their goods and workers hurried home. But for Michael, Aisha, and Waisiu, the day was far from over. Aisha led them through a narrow alleyway, avoiding the busier roads. She knew a small clinic where a kind doctor sometimes treated the poor for free. Michael walked in silence beside Waisiu, who limped slightly, his face bruised from the beating. He could still hear Waisiu's words in his head. "You should have let them beat me. The suffering would stop." It haunted him. How could a child believe that pain was the only way out? Michael clenched his fists. He had never felt so helpless. This was the world he had never seen. A world where hope was a luxury. And yet, Aisha moved with quiet determination, as if she had carried burdens like these for years. They arrived at the clinic, a tiny, run-down building at the edge of the neighborhood. Aisha knocked twice before a frail old man opened the door. "Ah, Aisha," he greeted her warmly. "You've come again." "Yes, Dr. Ojo," she said with a small smile. "I need your help." She stepped aside, revealing Waisiu. The doctor's expression softened. "Come in." Inside, the clinic was dimly lit, but clean. Bottles of medicine lined the walls, and an old examination table stood in the corner. Waisiu hesitated before sitting down. He flinched as Dr. Ojo gently examined his bruises. Michael stood by the doorway, watching. "You got lucky," the doctor said finally. "No broken bones. But you need rest." He applied some ointment and wrapped a bandage around Waisiu's swollen wrist. Michael exhaled. For the first time in hours, he felt relief. But Waisiu remained tense. His hands clenched into fists. "Why did you help me?" he asked suddenly. His voice was raw with emotion. "You don't even know me." Michael met his gaze. "Because you're human." Waisiu let out a shaky breath. "Nobody ever helps people like me. We're nothing but ghosts in this city." Aisha sat beside him. "That's not true." Waisiu laughed bitterly. "It is. You and this man might care, but the rest of the world doesn't." He looked at Michael. "You're new to this life, aren't you?" Michael stiffened. "What?" "I see the way you act," Waisiu continued. "You're not like us. You still move like someone who isn't used to hunger, to sleeping in the dirt." His bruised lips curled into a smirk. Waisiu's bruised lips curled into a smirk. "You're different. You don't belong here." Michael's stomach clenched. He had tried so hard to blend in, to live like an ordinary man, but Waisiu saw through him. Aisha frowned. "Waisiu, that's enough." "No, let him talk," Michael said, forcing himself to remain calm. "What do you mean?" Waisiu leaned back against the clinic wall, wincing slightly from the pain. "You're not like the rest of us. You move differently. You talk differently. Even when you sit on the street, you don't beg like the others. You just watch, like you're studying us." His eyes narrowed. "You're hiding something." Michael's heart pounded. Was he being too obvious? Aisha turned to him, her gaze curious now. "Michael, is there something we should know?" For a brief moment, he considered telling them everything. The truth about who he really was. That he wasn't just another struggling beggar. He was one of the richest men in Africa. But if he told them now, everything would change. So, he did the only thing he could. He lied. I wasn't always homeless," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I had a life before this. A better life. But I lost everything." Aisha's eyes softened. "Oh, Michael. I'm sorry." Waisiu, however, wasn't convinced. "Lost everything, huh?" He scoffed. "That still doesn't explain why you act different." Michael forced a small smile. Maybe I'm still getting used to this life. Waisiu studied him for a long moment before looking away. Suit yourself. Dr. Ojo finished wrapping Waisiu's wrist and patted his shoulder. You'll be fine, son. But try to stay out of trouble. Waisiu snorted. Trouble finds me. Document. The doctor sighed. It always does. Aisha stood up. Come on, Waisiu. I'll take you home. She turned to Michael. You coming? Michael hesitated. Something about Waisiu's words bothered him. You don't belong here. He had spent years feeling out of place in his own world of luxury. Now, even among the poor, he didn't fit in. Would he ever find where he truly belonged? With a sigh, he nodded. Yeah, I'm coming. As they stepped out of the clinic and back into the cold night, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that his past was creeping closer. And soon, he wouldn't be able to hide anymore. The night air was thick with the smell of roasted corn and burning wood as Michael, Aisha, and Waisiu made their way back through the slums. The streets were quieter now, but the occasional honking of danfos and the distant sound of street preachers echoed in the distance. Michael walked beside them in silence, lost in thought. Waisiu's words from earlier kept replaying in his mind. You don't belong here. He had underestimated how sharp the boy was. Even Aisha seemed to be watching him a little more closely now. He needed to be more careful. Suddenly, Waisiu groaned and stopped walking. He clutched his stomach, his face twisting in pain. Aisha immediately turned to him. What's wrong? I haven't eaten since yesterday, he muttered, swaying slightly. And that beating didn't help. Michael felt a pang of guilt. He should have asked earlier if the boy needed food. Aisha sighed and dug into the small cloth bag she carried. She pulled out a piece of dry bread and handed it to Waisiu. Here, eat this. The boy took it eagerly, biting into it with desperation. But as Michael watched him chew, he realized something. This was the first time in his life that he had ever seen someone so grateful for a piece of dry bread. Back in his real life, meals were prepared by professional chefs. He had never once worried about food or gone to bed hungry. And yet, here was Waisiu, bruised, beaten, and starving, but still grateful for the smallest thing. Michael felt a strange, uncomfortable weight settle in his chest. How could life be so unfair? Aisha must have noticed the look on his face because she nudged him gently. What's wrong? Michael hesitated. I don't understand how people survive like this. Aisha sighed. You get used to it. He frowned. But you shouldn't have to. She gave him a long look before shaking her head. Michael, this is life. Some are born rich, some are born poor. And those of us at the bottom don't have time to sit around questioning it. Michael opened his mouth to argue, but Waisiu interrupted. Can we keep moving? I'm trying to eat, but standing still makes it worse. Aisha chuckled. Come on then. They continued walking, but Michael was still deep in thought. He had spent years thinking that money was the most important thing in life, that it could solve any problem. But now, for the first time, he wasn't sure. Would money have saved Waisiu from getting beaten today? Would it have put food in his stomach? Maybe, but it wouldn't have changed the way the world saw him. Just as they reached a quiet corner, a sudden movement caught Michael's attention. A dark figure stepped out from the shadows. Waisiu, the man said in a low, threatening voice. Michael felt Waisiu stiffen beside him. Aisha's grip on her bag tightened. What do you want, Whale? She asked warily. Michael studied the man carefully. He was tall and lean, with a scar running down the side of his cheek. His eyes were sharp, calculating. I heard you got into some trouble today, Waisiu, Whale said, stepping closer. Stealing from rich women, huh? Waisiu swallowed hard, but said nothing. Michael felt the tension in the air thicken. He had seen men like this before, predators who fed on the weak. I don't have anything, Waisiu finally stammered. Whale smirked. That's too bad. Because I helped you once, remember? And now you owe me. Michael glanced at Aisha. Her face was set in a tight expression, her lips pressed together. This wasn't a random street thug. This was someone from Waisiu's past. Whale, please, Aisha said. He's just a boy. Whale ignored her and turned his attention to Michael instead. His eyes swept over him slowly, like he was trying to figure something out. Who's this? He asked. Michael kept his face neutral. Just a friend. Whale chuckled. A friend, huh? You don't look like you belong here. Michael's stomach tightened. Not again. He shrugged casually. Does it matter? Whale stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. Maybe not. But I don't trust outsiders. Michael held his ground, meeting Whale's gaze without flinching. A long silence stretched between them. Then, Whale reached out and snatched Waisiu's half-eaten bread. "Hey," Waisiu protested. But Whale just grinned. "You owe me, remember? Consider this payment." With that, he took a bite out of the bread and walked off, disappearing into the darkness. Michael felt rage bubbling inside him. Waisiu's hands clenched into fists. His whole body shook, not with fear, but with anger. Aisha sighed, rubbing her temples. "Waisiu, I told you to stay away from him." "I didn't have a choice," Waisiu muttered. "He helped me once, and now he thinks he owns me." Michael exhaled, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't just about hunger or survival anymore. There were deeper struggles in these streets. And whether he liked it or not, he was getting pulled into them. Aisha looked at him suddenly. "Michael, are you sure you're ready for this life?" Michael met her gaze. Was he? For years, he had been protected by his wealth. He had never truly faced the harshness of the world. But now, as he stood in the dimly lit street, watching Waisiu try to hold back his frustration, he realized something. Maybe this was exactly where he needed to be. "I'm ready," he said firmly. Aisha studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then let's go." As they continued walking, Michael knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just an experiment anymore. It was becoming real. The streets of the slums stretched endlessly before them, dimly lit by flickering streetlights and the occasional glow of makeshift kerosene lamps. The night felt heavier than usual, pressing down on them as they walked in silence. Waisiu, still fuming from his encounter with Whale, kicked at the loose gravel on the road. Michael could sense the anger simmering beneath the surface, and Aisha, usually the one to ease tensions, seemed lost in thought. Michael knew that Whale wasn't just a random street thug. He was something worse. A predator that preyed on the vulnerable, someone who saw debts as chains and people as possessions. He had seen men like Whale before, in his boardrooms, in high society, just dressed in expensive suits rather than tattered clothes. Power, no matter how small, could be a dangerous thing when placed in the wrong hands. As they turned a corner, Waisiu finally broke the silence. "I should have fought him," he muttered under his breath. Aisha sighed. "And what would that have done? Gotten you another broken wrist? Or worse, gotten you killed?" Michael agreed with Aisha, but he understood where Waisiu's frustration came from. The feeling of helplessness, of being trapped, of not having control. He had never experienced it before, not in the same way. Even now, playing the role of a beggar, he still had a way out, a safety net he could return to. But for them, this was life. There was no escape. "You don't understand," Waisiu muttered, his voice filled with bitterness. "You're not like us." Michael's brows furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Waisiu stopped walking and turned to him, his expression unreadable. "You don't talk like us. You don't act like us. Even when you sleep on the streets, you don't look desperate." Michael felt his stomach twist. Was he failing at his disguise? Or worse, was there something in him that no amount of acting could change? Before he could respond, Aisha put a hand on Waisiu's shoulder. "Enough, Waisiu. We all have our struggles." But Waisiu shook his head, his fists clenched. "Struggles?" He let out a bitter laugh. "Aisha, you think I don't see the way he looks at things? Like he's observing? Like this is all some story he's writing in his head?" Michael's breath caught in his throat. Was he really that obvious? He had thought he was blending in, that he had hidden his true self well. But Waisiu had seen through him from the very beginning. Michael took a step forward, forcing himself to stay calm. "I've lived on these streets for weeks now. I sleep in the cold, I beg for food, I've been beaten and chased off like the rest of you. What more do I have to prove?" Waisiu's jaw tightened. "You still don't get it." Aisha, sensing the tension, stepped between them. "Enough, both of you. We don't have time for this." Michael exhaled and turned away. The truth was, Waisiu wasn't entirely wrong. He wasn't like them. No matter how much he wanted to understand their world, he would always be an outsider. They continued walking, the silence between them heavier than before. But just as they were about to reach the market square, a loud commotion erupted ahead. Shouting, the clatter of metal, the sound of something, or someone, crashing to the ground. Aisha grabbed Waisiu's arm. "Stay close." Michael's instincts kicked in as he moved toward the noise. The market square, usually quiet at night, was now alive with chaos. People were gathered in a tight circle, shouting and gasping. Michael pushed his way to the front and froze. A man lay on the ground, blood spilling from a wound on his forehead. His clothes were ragged, his body thin, but his eyes were filled with terror. Standing over him was a group of men. Whale was among them. Michael's pulse quickened. This wasn't a simple mugging. This was a message. Waisiu inhaled sharply beside him. That's Baba Kunnel, he whispered. He sells groundnuts by the roadside. Aisha's face paled. What did he do? As if hearing their question, Whale's voice rang out. This old fool thought he could eat without paying his debts, he sneered, nudging the man's side with his foot. Now he knows better. Michael clenched his fists. How was this normal? How could an elderly man be beaten over a few naira while billionaires like him wasted millions on luxury vacations? Rage boiled in his veins. He wanted to do something. To stop this. But what could he do? He was supposed to be one of them. If he stepped in now, if he challenged Whale, he would expose himself. Aisha gripped his arm. Don't, she whispered, as if reading his mind. But Michael couldn't stand there and watch. Whale smirked and turned to his men. Teach him a lesson. Make sure he never forgets who's in charge here. Michael saw the fear in Baba Kunnel's eyes. He wasn't going to survive this. Without thinking, Michael stepped forward. Leave him alone. Silence. The crowd turned to look at him, shock written across their faces. Waisiu's eyes widened. Aisha grabbed his wrist, her nails digging into his skin. But Michael didn't back down. Whale raised an eyebrow, amused. What did you say? Michael took a slow step forward, his heart pounding. You've made your point. He gets it. Let him go. Whale studied him, his smirk widening. He wasn't angry. He was entertained. You've got guts, he said. But guts don't mean much when you're broke. Michael held his gaze. Being broke doesn't mean being powerless. Whale laughed, shaking his head. You're new here, aren't you? Because if you weren't, you'd know how things work. He snapped his fingers, and one of his men lunged at Michael. Michael barely had time to react before a fist slammed into his stomach. Pain exploded through him. He staggered back, gasping for breath. The crowd murmured, but no one stepped in to help. This was the way of the streets. Michael wiped blood from the corner of his mouth. Whale crouched in front of him, his voice dangerously soft. I don't know who you are, but you'd better learn fast. You want to play hero? Fine. But heroes don't last long here. Michael said nothing, his mind spinning. Aisha pulled him up roughly. Come on, she whispered. Before you get yourself killed. Whale turned back to Baba Kunnel. Let's go, boys. As they walked away, Michael watched the old man struggle to his feet, his hands trembling. This wasn't just about Whale anymore. This was about all of them. Michael realized then, this life was more dangerous than he had ever imagined. And if he wasn't careful, he wouldn't just lose his disguise. He'd lose himself. Michael's body ached from the blow, but it was nothing compared to the turmoil raging inside him. As he, Waisiu, and Aisha hurried away from the market square, the reality of his situation settled like a stone in his stomach. He had seen cruelty before, in boardrooms, in politics, in the hidden battles of the wealthy, but never like this. Here, power wasn't hidden behind contracts and handshakes. It was raw, brutal, and exercised without consequence. They turned into a narrow alleyway, finally stopping under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. Aisha wheeled on him, her eyes blazing with anger. What was that, Michael? She hissed. Are you trying to get yourself killed? Michael wiped the blood from his mouth. I couldn't just stand there and watch. Yes, you could, she snapped. Because that's how we survive. We don't play heroes here, Michael. This is the streets. If you step in, you make yourself a target. And guess what? Whale will remember you now. You think he's going to forget that some random beggar had the guts to challenge him? Michael remained silent. She was right. He had made a mistake. But how could he just watch an old man be beaten and do nothing? Waisiu, still breathing heavily from the adrenaline, sat on a broken wooden crate. She's right, you know. Whale doesn't forget. He shook his head. And you just painted a target on your back. Michael exhaled sharply, leaning against the rough brick wall. His ribs throbbed where the punch had landed, but it was nothing compared to the sense of helplessness he felt. How do you live like this? He asked quietly. Aisha crossed her arms. What choice do we have? Michael studied her, really studied her. She looked so small, so young, and yet there was a hardness in her eyes that didn't belong to someone her age. Waisiu, too. He had the weary expression of someone who had seen too much, who had learned long ago that life wasn't fair. And they had accepted it. That was what unsettled him the most. Wacy let out a humorless laugh. You still don't get it, do you? You think people like us want to live like this? That we don't want to fight back? He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. We have families to feed, Michael. We have people depending on us. If we start fights we can't win, they're the ones who suffer. Michael looked away, guilt gnawing at him. He had never considered that. For him, standing up to injustice had always been easy. As a billionaire, he had the power to challenge corruption, to sue those who wronged him, to walk into any room and command respect. But here, power belonged to the strongest, not the richest. Aisha sighed, running a hand through her short, curly hair. Look, I know your heart is in the right place. But if you really want to help people here, you can't do it like this. You need to be smart. You need to survive first. Michael nodded slowly. She was right. Again. For now, he needed to lay low. He needed to blend in. But deep down, the fire inside him refused to die. Whale and men like him thrived because people were too afraid to fight back. Maybe Michael couldn't change that overnight. But he wasn't going to sit back and do nothing. The next morning, the sun rose lazily over the slum, bathing the broken buildings in golden light. The scent of frying akara filled the air as vendors set up their makeshift stalls, preparing for another long day of business. Michael, now fully recovered from the previous night's ordeal, sat on an overturned bucket, watching as the city came to life. Aisha was already busy with her morning routine, sorting through scraps of fabric she had gathered from a nearby tailor's shop. She sewed small purses and wallets, selling them to anyone who could spare a little extra money. Wacy, on the other hand, was watching a group of young boys playing football in the dusty street. Michael had spent weeks here, but only now did he realize just how much people struggled to survive. Everywhere he looked, he saw hardship. A mother scolding her barefoot son for losing the little money she had given him for food. A teenage girl haggling with a customer over the price of second-hand clothes, her voice tinged with desperation. A frail old man sitting under a mango tree, his thin fingers clutching a wooden begging bowl. This was their reality. And suddenly, Michael felt ashamed. He had come here looking for love, as if this were some kind of experiment. But for them, this wasn't a game. This was life. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. What was he even doing here anymore? A voice interrupted his thoughts. Olga, wouldn't you go chop? Michael looked up to see Mom Ngozi, the elderly woman who ran a small food stall near the street corner. She was smiling at him, a steaming plate of yam porridge in her hands. Michael hesitated. He had no money left. She must have noticed his discomfort because she chuckled. No worry. You go pay later. Michael swallowed the lump in his throat. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know he was a billionaire. Yet she still showed him kindness. He accepted the plate, his chest tight with emotion. Thank you, he murmured. Mama Ngozi waved him off, turning to serve another customer. As Michael took his first bite, he realized something. Maybe love wasn't something he had to look for. Maybe it was already here, in the kindness of strangers, in the loyalty of friends, in the quiet sacrifices people made every day. But even as that thought settled in his mind, the shadows of the night before still lingered. Will wouldn't forget what happened, and sooner or later, Michael was going to have to face him again. The slum had its own rhythm, a way of life that moved like the tide, sometimes calm, sometimes violent. Michael had learned to move with it, to blend into the background like any other struggling man. But after what happened with Whale, the tide had shifted. His presence had been noticed. And in a place where power was held by fists and fear, being noticed was dangerous. Michael sat under the same mango tree where the old beggar from the previous day used to sit. The man was gone now, but the memory of his bruised face and trembling hands lingered. He had seen suffering before, on the news, in reports about the poor, in charity proposals written by his team, but never like this. Never this real. His stomach rumbled, but he ignored it. He had refused to take more food from Mom Ngozi, not because he wasn't grateful, but because he knew he had to learn to survive like everyone else. Aisha was nearby, selling her handmade purses. Wacy had disappeared early in the morning, likely running errands for the local street gangs to earn a few naira. Michael sighed. How did people live like this? Not just live, but survive, fight, wake up every day knowing nothing was promised? For the first time since he started this journey, doubt crept in. He wasn't just playing a role anymore. He was living it. And the longer he stayed, the more he felt the weight of it. Just then, He noticed a group of men gathered at the far end of the street, their voices low and tense. Michael recognized one of them immediately. Whale. His heart pounded. Whale wasn't alone. For other men stood with him, all with the same hardened expressions. One of them carried a wooden club, tapping it against his palm like he was itching for a reason to use it. Michael's eyes darted to Aisha. She hadn't noticed them yet. She was too busy arranging her items, calling out to passers-by. They were watching her. Michael felt cold fear seep into his bones. This wasn't just about him anymore. Aisha was in danger too. He forced himself to stand, moving towards her as casually as he could. Aisha, he said quietly. She barely glanced at him. What is it? We need to leave. She frowned, finally looking up. What are you talking about? Michael nodded toward Whale and his men. Her face paled. She didn't ask questions. She just started packing her things. But it was too late. Whale was already walking toward them. Michael's pulse quickened. This wasn't going to end well. Aisha's hands shook as she shoved her purses into a small sack. Michael, if they take me, she whispered, voice barely audible. Don't try to fight. Just run. Michael clenched his jaw. Run? How could he? He had come here thinking he could change something, be something different. But at this moment, with danger closing in, all he could think about was how powerless he was. Look who we have here, Whale sneered, stopping just a few feet away. His voice dripped with mockery. The hero from yesterday. Michael's fists tightened. What do you want? Whale smirked. You made me look bad, Beggar. He stepped closer. That's a problem. Michael held his ground. I didn't make you look bad, Whale. You did that yourself. The words were barely out of his mouth before Whale lunged. Michael saw the punch coming, but he wasn't fast enough to dodge it completely. Whale's fist connected with his shoulder, sending him stumbling backward. Pain shot through him, but he refused to fall. Aisha gasped, stepping in front of him. Whale, please. He didn't mean anything by it. Whale ignored her, his eyes locked onto Michael. You think you're smart, he growled. You think you can talk back to me? Michael steadied himself, breathing hard. He had two choices. He could fight back, or he could let Whale win. Every instinct screamed at him to stand his ground, to show Whale that fear wasn't a currency he traded in. But Aisha's warning echoed in his mind. If you start fights you can't win, other people suffer. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to look away. I'm sorry, he said, the words bitter on his tongue. Whale scoffed. That's what I thought. Then, to Michael's horror, Whale grabbed Aisha by the wrist. She yelped, struggling. Whale, let me go. Michael's vision blurred with rage. Let her go. Whale chuckled, his grip tightening. You don't get to make demands, Beggar. He yanked Aisha forward, making her stumble. She owes me. If she doesn't have the money, she can pay me another way. Michael's world snapped. Everything inside him burned. He wasn't a beggar. He wasn't a helpless man on the streets. He was Michael Adeyemi, and he was done pretending. His fist shot forward before he could stop himself, connecting with Whale's jaw. The impact sent a shockwave up his arm, but it was Whale who staggered back, clutching his face in shock. For a brief moment, the street fell silent. Then chaos. Whale's men lunged at Michael. A fist slammed into his ribs. A knee jabbed into his stomach. Michael gasped, doubling over as pain exploded through him. Someone grabbed his shirt, yanking him upright. A punch landed across his face, splitting his lip. Through the haze of pain, he saw Aisha struggling, screaming for them to stop. Michael hit the ground hard, his vision swimming. He tasted blood. Whale loomed over him, eyes burning with fury. He wiped his bleeding lip, laughing coldly. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Beggar. Then the world faded to black. Pain. It was the first thing Michael felt as consciousness returned. A dull, throbbing ache spread across his body, pulsing in his ribs, his jaw, and the side of his head. His lip was split, and when he licked at it, the metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. He tried to move, but a sharp pain stabbed through his side, forcing a groan from his throat. Where was he? Slowly, he forced his heavy eyelids open. Darkness. The air smelled of damp wood, rotting food, and sweat. A single dim bulb flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows against the cracked walls. His hands were bound, ropes digging into his wrists. Michael's pulse quickened. He wasn't on the street anymore. He had been taken. His last memory was Whale's men raining blows on him, his body collapsing under the assault. He had heard Aisha screaming before everything had gone black. Where was she now? Was she safe? Michael struggled against the ropes, but the fibers only cut deeper into his skin. His muscles screamed in protest. Footsteps. His head snapped toward the sound. A heavy door creaked open, and light spilled into the small, filthy room. Two men entered first, both broad-shouldered, faces hardened with street brutality. One of them cracked his knuckles, eyeing Michael like a hungry wolf. Then, Will stepped inside. His lip was swollen from Michael's punch, but the grin on his face was full of cruel amusement. Well, look who's awake, Will drawled, stepping closer. Michael said nothing, his eyes cold and unflinching. Will crouched in front of him, tilting his head. You've got fight in you, I'll give you that. But you made a mistake, Beggar. You don't hit me and walk away. Michael's jaw clenched. Where's Aisha? Will smirked. Safe. For now. He leaned in, lowering his voice. But that depends on you. Michael's stomach twisted. Let her go, he said, his voice low but firm. Will chuckled. Oh, now you want to negotiate? When you had the chance to stay quiet, you chose to be a hero. He shook his head. Bad choice. Michael's fists clenched against the ropes. What do you want? Will's smirk widened. Now we're talking. He stood up, nodding at one of his men. The man disappeared through the door, returning moments later with a metal bucket. Michael barely had time to brace himself before icy water was thrown over him. The shock stole his breath, the freezing liquid drenching his clothes, dripping from his face, soaking his wounds. His body convulsed involuntarily from the cold. Will laughed. That should wake you up. Michael inhaled sharply, forcing himself to suppress his shivering. He wouldn't give Will the satisfaction of seeing him break. Will crouched again, his grin vanishing. I want to know who you really are. Michael stilled. What? Don't play dumb, Will sneered. You're no ordinary beggar. He motioned toward Michael's hands. Your skin is too soft. No real beggar looks like that. Michael remained silent. Will leaned in closer. You show up out of nowhere, talk big, and punch like someone who's had training. Who are you? Michael knew he had two choices. He could lie, keep up the act, claim he was just another poor man trying to survive. Or he could tell the truth. That he was Michael Adeyemi, Billionaire CEO. That he had come to the slums to find love, to escape the fake people in his world. But that truth could cost him more than just his cover. It could cost him his life. The moment Will realized who he was, the game would change. Ransom. Power. Revenge. Will wouldn't just hurt him. He would use him. So Michael made his choice. I'm nobody, he said, his voice steady. Just a man trying to survive. Will studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed, shaking his head. I really hoped you'd be smart about this. Before Michael could react, Will's fist slammed into his stomach. Pain exploded through him. He gasped, his head spinning as he fought to keep from doubling over. Will straightened, rolling his shoulders. I'll ask again. Who are you? Michael forced himself to look up. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. I already told you. Will's face darkened. He nodded again. Another blow. Michael's ribs screamed in agony, but he refused to make a sound. He wouldn't break. He wouldn't give Will what he wanted. The door opened again, and one of Will's men stepped inside, whispering something in his ear. Will's expression shifted slightly, and he clicked his tongue in frustration. Looks like we'll have to finish this later, he muttered. He turned back to Michael, smirking. Enjoy your stay, beggar. It's going to be a long night. With that, he walked out, leaving Michael in the dimly lit room, soaked, bruised, and bleeding. Michael exhaled shakily, his mind racing. He needed to escape. Not just for himself, but for Aisha. Michael sat in the darkness, his body screaming with pain, but his mind sharper than ever. Every second that passed was a countdown. He had to escape, not just for himself, but for Aisha. He couldn't let Will use her as leverage. His fingers worked at the ropes binding his wrists. The fibers had already torn into his skin, but pain was the least of his worries. He had once watched a documentary on survival tactics, and he remembered something crucial. Ropes loosen when muscles are tensed before being tied. Slowly, carefully, he flexed his wrists, pushing outward just enough to create a slight gap between his skin and the rope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He inhaled deeply, ignoring the stinging cold of his wet clothes. His heartbeat steadied. Then he heard something, footsteps. Michael stilled. The door creaked open, and a figure slipped inside. Aisha. She moved cautiously, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Her breathing was ragged, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "Michael," she whispered, her voice thick with worry. His relief was immediate, but he kept his voice low. "Aisha, what are you doing here?" "I had to find you," she murmured, kneeling beside him. "Well, he's planning something. He wants to sell you to a gang leader, someone dangerous. They think you're worth more alive than dead." Michael's stomach tightened. He had expected a ransom demand, but this was worse. If Whale handed him over to a criminal syndicate, there was no telling what would happen. Torture, blackmail, death. "How did you get past the guards?" he asked. Aisha's lips pressed together. "I lied. Told them I was coming to convince you to cooperate." She swallowed. "We don't have much time." Michael nodded, shifting his wrists again. "Can you untie me?" She moved quickly, her fingers fumbling at the knots. Her breath hitched when she saw the raw wounds on his wrists. "They hurt you." "I'm fine," he muttered. The ropes loosened, and as soon as his hands were free, Michael stretched his fingers, flexing the stiffness away. His shoulders ached, but he pushed through it. Aisha glanced nervously at the door. "They'll be back soon." Michael's mind raced. They needed a plan, and they needed one fast. He looked around, taking in every detail of the dimly lit room. The walls were cracked, moisture dripping from the ceiling. There was one window, small, rusty, but possibly an escape route. Michael stood, testing his balance. His ribs ached, but he pushed forward. "Aisha, do you trust me?" Her dark eyes met his. "Yes." "Then do exactly as I say." She nodded. Michael quickly formulated a plan. They couldn't fight their way out. That would be suicide. But if they could create a distraction, he reached into his pocket and found something small, the lighter he always carried. A risky idea formed in his mind. Michael turned to Aisha. "There's only one way we're getting out of here." He held up the lighter. "We need to start a fire." Her eyes widened. "Are you crazy? That will bring everyone here." "Exactly," he said. "They'll panic, and in the confusion, we slip out." She hesitated, but after a moment, she nodded. "Okay, what do we burn?" Michael scanned the room. There was a pile of old newspapers in the corner, damp but flammable enough with some effort. He knelt, flicking the lighter. The flames sputtered to life. Aisha watched as he carefully ignited the papers. Smoke curled upward, and soon, the tiny flame grew. Michael stood. "When the fire spreads, they'll open that door. Be ready to run." Aisha swallowed hard, gripping his arm. "What if this doesn't work?" Michael gave her a small, reassuring smile. "It will." A loud crack filled the air as the fire spread, licking up the wooden support beam in the corner. Smoke thickened, coiling toward the ceiling. Seconds later, shouts erupted from outside. Michael and Aisha pressed against the wall, waiting. The door burst open. A guard rushed inside. "What the hell?" Michael moved. In a single swift motion, he lunged at the man, slamming his elbow into his throat. The guard choked, stumbling back, but Michael didn't stop. He grabbed the man's head and smashed it against the doorframe. The guard collapsed. Aisha gasped. "Michael!" "No time," he said, grabbing her hand. "Run!" They darted into the hallway, smoke following them. Another guard turned the corner, eyes widening. "Hey!" Michael didn't hesitate. He grabbed a loose wooden plank from the floor and swung. The man barely had time to react before the wood cracked against his skull. He slumped to the ground. Aisha covered her mouth, shocked at how fast Michael moved. He turned to her. "Go. Now." They ran. The building was a maze, narrow hallways twisting into darkness. The fire behind them grew, smoke filling the air. Michael's lungs burned, but he kept moving, dragging Aisha with him. Then, a door ahead. Michael slammed into it, pushing with everything he had. It burst open, revealing the night sky. Freedom. They stumbled outside, gasping for air. The slums stretched before them, alleyways leading in every direction. Behind them, the fire raged. Michael turned to Aisha. "We need to disappear before Whale realizes we're gone." She nodded breathlessly. They vanished into the shadows. This wasn't over. Michael and Aisha sprinted through the darkened streets, their footsteps echoing against the narrow alleyways. The city was alive, yet they felt invisible. Two fugitives lost in the chaos of Lagos' underbelly. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke from the fire they had set. Sirens wailed in the distance, a mix of police and fire trucks responding to the destruction. But Michael knew better than to assume safety. Will wouldn't let them escape so easily. They dashed into a crowded street market, the noise of vendors and customers masking their frantic breaths. "Slow down," Michael whispered, pulling Aisha close as they wove through the crowd. "If we look like we're running, we'll stand out." Aisha nodded, adjusting her shawl to cover her face. Michael did the same with the hood of his tattered sweatshirt, blending in with the throng of people. They moved carefully, passing wooden stalls stacked with ripe plantains, crates of fish, and steaming pots of jollof rice. The chatter around them was a mix of Yoruba, Pidgin, and English, but Michael could barely process any of it. His mind was racing. He needed a plan. Fast. Aisha tugged at his sleeve. "Where do we go?" Michael glanced around. Whale's men wouldn't be far behind. He needed a safe house, somewhere they could hide until he could figure out their next move. "There's a place," he murmured, leading her toward a side street. "I know someone who might help." Aisha didn't question him, only followed. Her trust in him made Michael's chest tighten. He wasn't used to people believing in him beyond his money. They made their way to a small, rundown cyber cafe tucked between two abandoned buildings. A flickering neon sign read StarNet Cafe. Michael knocked twice, a pattern he remembered from years ago. The door creaked open, revealing a wiry man with tired eyes and dreadlocks pulled into a loose ponytail. His gaze landed on Michael, and his brows shot up. "Omo, Michael?" The man's voice was filled with disbelief. What are you doing here, looking like this?" Michael gave a tired smile. "I need help, Femi." Femi hesitated, then glanced around before stepping aside. "Come inside, quick." Michael and Aisha slipped in, and Femi bolted the door. The interior of the cafe was dimly lit, with ancient computers lining the walls. The air smelled of dust and cheap coffee. Michael turned to Femi. "I don't have time to explain everything, but we're being hunted. We need a safe place to lay low." Femi exhaled sharply, scratching his head. "You've got some serious people looking for you, man. Word on the street is that Whale's got a bounty on your head. Every street thug is on high alert." Michael clenched his fists. He had expected as much. Whale was desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. Aisha shifted nervously. "Is there anywhere safe?" Femi sighed. "I might know a spot. It's not much, but it's hidden. Follow me." He led them through the back of the cafe, down a staircase that smelled of mildew and neglect. At the bottom was a tiny basement room, barely big enough for a mattress and a single chair. Femi gestured. "Stay here for now. I'll bring food later." Michael placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, Femi. I won't forget this." Femi waved him off. "Just don't get me killed." As he left, Michael turned to Aisha. She looked exhausted, dark circles beneath her eyes. "You should rest," he said softly. She hesitated, then sat on the mattress. "And you?" Michael leaned against the wall, staring at the ceiling. "I'll keep watch." Outside, the city roared on, but in that moment, Michael knew one thing. This fight wasn't over. Michael sat against the cold, damp wall of the basement, his ears attuned to every sound outside. The distant honking of car horns, the rhythmic buzz of Lagos nightlife, and the occasional shout of a street vendor reminded him that the city never slept. Yet down here, in this suffocating room, he and Aisha were trapped in an eerie silence. Aisha lay on the thin mattress, but Michael could tell she wasn't asleep. Her breathing was too sharp, too uneven. He watched as she shifted uncomfortably, hugging herself for warmth. "You should rest," he murmured. She opened her eyes, the dim light reflecting the fear and exhaustion etched into her face. "How can I rest when Whale's men are out there looking for us?" Michael sighed, running a hand over his unkempt beard. "We'll figure a way out." Aisha hesitated before sitting up. "Michael, tell me the truth. Why is Whale after you so badly? This isn't just about you being a beggar, is it?" Michael tensed. She wasn't wrong. Whale's obsession with capturing him wasn't just about revenge for the escape. It was something more. Michael exhaled. "Whale isn't just a street thug. He's involved in things bigger than I realized. Illegal deals, human trafficking, weapons smuggling. He sees me as a threat." Aisha's lips parted in shock. "How?" Michael looked away. "I know something that could ruin him." Aisha's voice dropped to a whisper. "What do you know?" Michael hesitated. He had kept this secret for too long, but Aisha had risked everything to help him. She deserved the truth. "I've been investigating Whale for months," Michael admitted. "Before I went undercover as a beggar, I had my suspicions that he was connected to some powerful people. I hired private investigators, What they found, he clenched his fists. Let's just say, if I expose him, a lot of people in high places will fall. Aisha inhaled sharply. You were gathering evidence? Michael nodded. But then I disappeared into the streets, hoping to confirm what I'd learned. That's when Whale found me. He must have suspected I was onto him. Aisha's hand trembled. And now he won't stop until you're silenced. Michael looked at her, his jaw tight. Exactly. The air between them grew heavy. Aisha wrapped her arms around herself. So what do we do now? We can't hide here forever. Michael's mind raced. They needed to move. Soon. Femi's safe house was a temporary solution, but Whale's reach extended far beyond the streets. If they stayed too long, someone would betray them. Then, as if confirming his fears, a sudden loud knock echoed from above. Aisha stiffened. Who was that? Michael motioned for silence. He pulled out the small, rusted knife he had stolen from one of Whale's guards during their escape. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The knock came again, louder, more urgent. Michael crept toward the basement door, pressing his ear against it. Then a voice. Michael, it's me. Michael's muscles relaxed slightly. Femi. He unbolted the door, just enough to peek out. Femi stood there, looking more nervous than before. His eyes darted around as if checking for threats. Let me in, Femi whispered. Michael hesitated before opening the door. What's wrong? Femi stepped inside quickly, shutting the door behind him. We have a problem. A big one. Michael crossed his arms. Talk. Femi ran a hand down his face. Word is out, man. Whale has doubled the bounty on your head. He's telling people you stole something valuable from him. Michael's stomach turned. What? Femi nodded grimly. He's saying you took a flash drive. One with information that could bring down his entire operation. Michael's blood ran cold. That flash drive. The one he had hidden weeks ago. Femi leaned closer. Michael, tell me the truth. Do you have it? Michael hesitated. Aisha's eyes widened as she looked between them. Finally, Michael sighed. I hid it. Femi cursed under his breath. Whale is tearing the city apart looking for you. His men are everywhere. I barely made it here without being spotted. Michael rubbed his temple. This was bad. Aisha spoke up, her voice steady. Then we have no choice. We need to get the flash drive before Whale does. Michael looked at her. It's not that simple. It's hidden in a place crawling with Whale's men. Femi frowned. Where? Michael exhaled. An old abandoned church in Mushin. Femi's eyes widened. Mushin? That's deep in Whale's territory. Aisha stood. Then we go now before they figure it out. Michael studied her for a moment. She was afraid, but she wasn't backing down. He turned to Femi. Can you get us transport? Femi hesitated, then nodded. I know a guy, but it'll cost you. Michael smirked despite the tension. Don't worry. I'll pay when this is over. Femi sighed. You better. Because right now, you're the most wanted man in Lagos. Michael's eyes darkened. Then let's finish this. The plan was reckless. Suicidal, even. But Michael knew they had no choice. If Whale got his hands on the flash drive first, everything would be over. The evidence of his crimes, the smuggling, the money laundering, the trafficking, would be destroyed. Michael had risked too much to let that happen. Femi made the call, speaking in hushed tones to a contact he swore was trustworthy. Within 30 minutes, they were crammed into the back of a battered Danfo, an old yellow minibus barely holding itself together. The driver, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, glanced at Michael through the rearview mirror. His eyes lingered a little too long. You sure you want to go to Mushin at this time? He asked in a gruff voice. Michael met his gaze. Just drive. The man shrugged, but Michael didn't miss the way his grip on the steering wheel tightened. He didn't trust him, but for now he had no choice. The ride through Lagos. The minibus rattled as they sped through the city. Streetlights flickered over the dusty roads, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Outside, Lagos was alive. Hawkers weaving between cars, music blasting from roadside stalls, the pungent smell of suya and fried plantain filling the air. But beneath the surface, there was tension. Michael noticed the way people glanced over their shoulders, the way conversations hushed when they passed by certain corners. Whale's men were everywhere. Aisha sat beside him, her arms folded tightly. He could feel her anxiety, though she tried to hide it. You okay? He asked softly. She nodded. I don't like this. Michael understood. Mushin wasn't just dangerous, it was a war zone. Femi, who sat in the front, kept checking his phone. If we get caught out there, we're dead, he muttered. I hope you have a plan, rich boy. Michael smirked, though there was no humor in his eyes. Get in, get the flash drive, get out. That's the plan. Femi scoffed. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. As they neared Mushin, the streets grew darker. The towering buildings loomed over them like silent watchers. The people here moved differently, furtive glances, quick steps. Michael had been here before, but never like this. Never as a hunted man. The driver pulled up at a deserted corner. This is where I drop you, he announced. Michael frowned. We're still 5 blocks from the church. The driver chuckled, lighting a cigarette. You think I'll risk my life driving into Whale's stronghold? Oga, you day mad. Michael clenched his jaw. Fine. Aisha was already stepping out. Let's go. Femi muttered a curse, but followed. The driver sped off the moment their feet touched the ground, disappearing into the night. Now, they were alone. A city that breathed fear. Mushin was eerily quiet. It wasn't that people weren't around, they were. But they watched. From shadowed alleys, from behind rusted metal gates, from dimly lit doorways. Michael pulled his hood lower, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. We move fast, he whispered. They stuck to the side streets, avoiding the main roads where Whale's boys were likely patrolling. The deeper they went, the more Aisha tensed. Then, a whistle. Low. Sharp. Coming from somewhere behind them. Michael froze. Femi muttered, shit. Aisha turned. What? Michael didn't answer. He knew what that whistle meant. It was a signal. Someone had seen them. Keep walking, he murmured. Slowly, they turned into another alley. But Michael already knew. It was too late. Footsteps. Heavy. Rushed. They were being followed. Michael grabbed Aisha's hand. Run. They took off. The chase. They sprinted through the labyrinth of Mushin's back streets, dodging piles of garbage, leaping over gutters filled with murky water. The sound of footsteps behind them grew louder. Michael risked a glance back. 3 men, dressed in dark clothing. One had a machete. The other 2 carried pistols. Move, he shouted. They burst out of the alley onto a larger road. A few startled pedestrians looked up, but no one interfered. No one ever interfered in Mushin. Ahead, the old abandoned church loomed, its once grand entrance now covered in graffiti and grime. Michael pushed forward, shoving the heavy doors open. They stumbled inside, the air thick with dust and decay. Aisha gasped for breath. Where did you hide it? Michael scanned the ruined pews, the collapsed ceiling where moonlight streamed through. Then he saw it. A small, rusted vent near the altar. Michael rushed to it, dropping to his knees. His fingers clawed at the edges, prying it open. His heart pounded. If it was gone. His hand closed around something cold. The flash drive. He yanked it free just as gunfire exploded outside. Aisha screamed. Femi cursed. Michael spun around just in time to see the doors burst open, and Whale himself walked in. A slow smile spread across his scarred face. Michael, he drawled. You should have stayed dead. Michael shoved the flash drive into Aisha's hands. Run. The moment Michael told Aisha to run, she hesitated, just for a second. It was a second too long. Whale's men were already moving, spreading out like predators closing in on wounded prey. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears. There were too many of them. There was no way out. But he had faced worse odds before. His hand clenched into a fist, his body tensing for a fight. If he was going down, he wasn't going down easy. Aisha gripped the flash drive so tightly that her knuckles turned white. I'm not leaving you, she whispered fiercely. Whale's deep, mocking laughter filled the ruined church. Romance. How touching. He stepped forward, his long coat swaying with each step. The dim light revealed the full cruelty of his face, the deep scar running down his cheek, the cold amusement in his dead eyes. Michael forced himself to remain calm. Whale, he said, his voice even. You don't have to do this. Oh, but I do. Whale gestured to the men beside him. One of them, a tall, wiry man with a tattoo snaking up his arm, pulled out a pistol and cocked it. Michael felt Aisha tense beside him. He squeezed her hand gently. Give me the drive, Whale continued, stepping closer. And maybe, just maybe, I'll let you both walk out of here alive. Michael chuckled, shaking his head. You won't. You never leave loose ends. Whale's smile widened. True. And then, without warning, he lunged. The battle in the church. Michael barely had time to react. Whale was fast. Faster than he had expected. Their bodies collided with brutal force, sending them crashing into one of the broken pews. The rotting wood splintered beneath them as they tumbled to the ground. Michael gritted his teeth, rolling away just as Whale's fist came swinging toward his jaw. He dodged, but the second punch caught him in the ribs. Pain exploded in his side. Focus. Stay on your feet. Whale came at him again, but this time, Michael was ready. He ducked low, sweeping his leg out. Whale stumbled. That was all Michael needed. He surged forward, slamming his elbow into Whale's chest, then followed it with a sharp knee to the gut. Whale let out a strangled curse, staggering back. But before Michael could press the advantage, a gunshot rang out. Aisha screamed. Michael froze. His heart slammed against his ribs as he turned toward the sound. One of Whale's men had fired into the air. The next second, Femi was on the ground. Blood pooled beneath his shoulder. Aisha let out a strangled sob, her hands trembling as she dropped to Femi's side. No, 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 no. Michael's stomach twisted. Femi's face was pale, his breathing ragged. The blood spread quickly, soaking into the dust-covered floor. Whale chuckled, wiping a trickle of blood from his mouth. I warned you, Michael. Now hand over the drive, or your little friend dies. Michael clenched his fists. His mind raced. There was no way out of this. Not without getting more people killed. His eyes met Aisha's. The silent plea in them nearly shattered him. He had to make a choice. A dangerous gamble. Slowly, Michael raised his hands. All right, he said, his voice calm. You win. Whale's grin widened. Smart man. Michael reached into his pocket, pretending to pull out the flash drive. But instead of the drive, he grabbed a handful of dust and rubble from the ground. In one swift motion, he flung it straight into Whale's eyes. Whale roared in pain, staggering back, clawing at his face. Michael moved. He grabbed Aisha's hand, yanking her up. Run! She didn't hesitate this time. The escape. Gunfire erupted behind them as they raced toward the side exit. Bullets splintered the walls, sending shards of brick and wood flying. Michael didn't dare look back. Aisha clutched the flash drive to her chest as they burst through the church doors into the darkened streets. They ran, faster than they ever had before. Behind them, Whale's men were in pursuit. Michael's lungs burned. His legs ached. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close to freedom. As they rounded a corner, a black SUV skidded to a stop in front of them. For a split second, Michael thought they were trapped, until the window rolled down. Adebayo, get in. Michael didn't hesitate. He yanked the door open, shoving Aisha inside before diving in himself. The moment the door slammed shut, Adebayo floored the gas. The SUV roared down the street, leaving the church, and Whale, behind. Michael leaned back, gasping for breath. His hands were still shaking. Aisha turned to him, her eyes wide, her face pale. We made it, she whispered. Michael exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Not yet, he murmured. This isn't over. And deep down, he knew, the worst was still to come. The city lights blurred into streaks as Adebayo sped through the streets. The atmosphere inside the SUV was thick with tension, their breathing still heavy from the escape. The weight of what had just happened pressed on all of them. Michael clenched his fists. Will had Femi. His stomach churned at the thought. He knew what Whale was capable of. His old friend had turned into something monstrous. If they didn't act fast, Femi wouldn't make it through the night. Aisha, clutching the flash drive to her chest, broke the silence. Where are we going? Michael exhaled sharply. Somewhere safe. He turned to Adebayo. Take us to the safe house. Adebayo nodded, weaving expertly through the Lagos traffic. We'll be there in 20 minutes. Oga. Michael looked over at Aisha. Her face was still pale, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the drive. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, but that would be a lie. Nothing about this was okay. The safe house. They arrived at a hidden compound on the outskirts of the city. The place was an old warehouse Michael had repurposed years ago for emergencies like this. The high walls, security cameras, and reinforced gates made it one of the few places in Lagos where Whale couldn't reach them. As soon as they stepped inside, Michael activated the security system. A soft beep confirmed that they were locked in. Safe. For now. Aisha sank onto the worn-out couch, her shoulders slumping. I can't believe this is happening, she whispered. Michael took a deep breath. Neither can I. He turned to her, his eyes serious. Let me see the drive. She hesitated, then handed it to him. Michael plugged it into a laptop, his heart pounding. This was it. A progress bar appeared on the screen, loading the encrypted files. And then, rows upon rows of classified financial transactions flashed before them. Michael's eyes widened. This wasn't just proof of corruption. This was a roadmap of an entire empire built on fraud, money laundering, and blood money. Will hadn't just been skimming off the top. He was running a full-blown crime syndicate. Aisha's hand covered her mouth. This is huge. Michael leaned back, exhaling. Bigger than I thought. Adebayo frowned, his arms crossed. So what now? Michael's jaw clenched. We use this to bring Whale down. Aisha looked at him, doubt in her eyes. You think that's possible? He has the police, the politicians, he owns the system. Michael nodded. Which is why we don't take it to the police. He pointed at the files. We take it to the people. The media. The international press. If we make this public, Whale will have nowhere to hide. Adebayo let out a low whistle. That's risky, Oga. He won't go down without a fight. Michael's eyes darkened. Then we fight. Aisha's confession. The room fell silent. Aisha hesitated before speaking. There's something I need to tell you. Michael turned to her. What is it? She looked down, twisting her fingers. Whale didn't just want me because of this drive. Michael's breath caught. What do you mean? She swallowed hard. My father was one of his business partners. Michael's world tilted. What? Aisha took a deep breath. I didn't know at first. But a few years ago, my father got involved in one of Whale's illegal deals. When he tried to leave, Whale had him killed. Michael's stomach twisted. She met his eyes, her voice shaking. I thought, if I exposed him, I could finally get justice for my father. Michael's fists clenched. He had known Aisha had secrets, but he hadn't expected this. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Michael stood. We're ending this. Together. Aisha exhaled shakily and nodded. Together. And as they stared at the screen, at the evidence that could change everything, they both knew. There was no turning back now. The air inside the safe house was thick with tension. The weight of their next move pressed down on them like a boulder. Michael ran a hand over his face, his mind racing. Exposing Whale wasn't going to be easy. This was war, and the enemy had more power than they could imagine. Adebayo stood near the door, keeping a watchful eye on the security monitors. Aisha sat at the table, her fingers drumming anxiously against the wood. The flash drive lay between them like a ticking time bomb. We can't stay here long, Adebayo muttered. If Whale figures out we have this, he'll come after us with everything he's got. Michael nodded. We need to act fast. He turned to Aisha. Do you know any journalists we can trust? People who aren't under Whale's payroll. She hesitated, then reached for her phone. I know someone. A foreign investigative journalist, Daniel Fisher. He's been covering corruption in Nigeria for years. If anyone can get this out to the world, it's him. Michael's jaw tightened. Call him. Aisha tapped a few buttons and put the phone to her ear. The line rang once, twice, then clicked. Daniel, it's Aisha. A pause. Then a deep voice responded. Aisha? Why are you calling me so late? I have something big, Daniel. Something that could expose one of the most powerful men in Lagos. Silence. Then, meet me at the old factory near Ikoyi Bridge. Midnight. Aisha's grip on the phone tightened. It's dangerous. Daniel's voice was firm. I know. But if what you have is as big as you're saying, then we need to act before they bury it. Aisha exhaled. All right. We'll be there. She hung up, looking at Michael. We have to leave now. Michael nodded and turned to Adebayo. Get the car ready. Adebayo frowned. Oga, you sure this is a good idea? What if it's a setup? Michael's eyes darkened. Then we fight our way out. The trap. The drive to the abandoned factory was silent, tense. The roads were dark, the city quieter than usual. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows over the streets. Michael felt the weight of a gun in his jacket. He hoped he wouldn't have to use it. As they approached the factory, an unsettling feeling crept up his spine. Something didn't feel right. Adebayo parked a few blocks away. We go on foot from here, Michael said. Less chance of being spotted. Aisha nodded, gripping the flash drive tightly. They moved through the empty streets, their footsteps echoing in the night. The factory loomed ahead, a decaying structure with shattered windows and rusted metal walls. Michael scanned the area. Stay close. They slipped inside through a side entrance. The air smelled of rust and oil. The only light came from the moon filtering through the broken ceiling. Then, a voice echoed through the factory. Right on time. Michael's blood ran cold. Whale stepped out of the shadows, flanked by 4 armed men. Aisha gasped, taking a step back. No. Michael's fists clenched. They had walked right into a trap. Whale smirked, his gold watch glinting under the dim light. Did you really think I wouldn't know what you were up to? Aisha's voice trembled. How? Whale chuckled. You think I became this powerful without knowing how to handle a few rats? His eyes flicked to Adebayo. I must say, I'm disappointed, Adebayo. I thought you were smarter than this. Adebayo's face was unreadable. You always were a snake, Whale. Whale sighed, shaking his head. And now, because of your stupidity, you're all going to die. Michael's mind raced. Think. Fast. His hand inched toward his gun. But before he could make a move, gunfire erupted. Chaos and blood. Bullets tore through the air as Michael shoved Aisha to the ground. The gunmen fired blindly, their shots echoing through the factory. Adebayo pulled out his own gun and fired back, taking down one of Whale's men. Michael rolled behind a stack of crates, his heart hammering. He peeked out and aimed, 2 shots, precise. Another man dropped. Whale cursed, ducking behind cover. Killed him. Now, Aisha crawled behind a metal beam, her breath shaky. She clutched the flash drive as if it were her lifeline. Michael's ears rang from the gunfire. He counted. 3 enemies left. Adebayo took down another. 2 left. Whale fired in their direction, missing by inches. You think you can ruin me? You're nothing without your money, Michael. Michael smirked, steadying his aim. Then let's see who you are without your power. He squeezed the trigger. A bullet ripped through Whale's shoulder. Whale screamed, dropping his gun. Blood soaked his expensive suit. His last remaining bodyguards panicked and ran. Michael strode toward him, gun still raised. It's over, Whale. Whale gritted his teeth, his eyes burning with hatred. You think this ends here? He let out a bitter laugh. You have no idea what you've started. Michael's jaw clenched. I know exactly what I've started. Aisha stepped forward, holding up the flash drive. This will destroy you. Whale's eyes flickered with fear for the first time. He opened his mouth, to beg, to threaten. Michael didn't care. Adebayo knocked him out with a single punch. Michael turned to Aisha. Let's finish this. The upload. Back at the safe house, Michael plugged the flash drive into his laptop. He pulled up a secure server and began uploading everything. Aisha sat beside him, her hands still trembling. Once this goes out, there's no turning back. Michael exhaled. We don't need to turn back. We move forward. The progress bar filled. 100%. Seconds later, the files were broadcasted to journalists, international agencies, and anti-corruption organizations. The world would finally see the truth. Michael leaned back, exhaustion washing over him. It's done. Aisha looked at him, something unspoken passing between them. What now? Michael smirked, glancing at the unconscious Whale. Now we watch the empire burn. To be continued.